Hello and welcome to our virtual PCRC panel presentation on the challenges, strategies, and outcomes related to implementation of academic interventions. First off, thank you to my co-organizer, Dr. Amber Ray, and to Dr. John Romig for joining us, and Dr. Sarah Pinkelman for joining us as our moderator during our live session. What we'll be hoping to address within this panel is the strategies and outcomes of studies in which teachers and pre-service teachers implemented academic interventions. I'll be talking about a mathematics intervention, Amber will be talking about a writing intervention, and John will be talking about a reading intervention. We also hope during our live session to talk about challenges related to implementation and strategies to overcome those challenges, as well as factors that go beyond implementation fidelity in relationship to student outcomes. So I'll start us off with the implementation of a virtual rate of change problem-solving intervention. The rationale for the study is that we know that slope or rate of change is a key concept within secondary mathematics. It's relevant to success in academic courses, professional careers, and independent living, but many students struggle with understanding and using slope, especially students with disabilities. Additionally, very little research has been conducted looking at whether or not interventions can help students improve their understanding of slope, and that's especially the case when it comes to students with disabilities. The Integrated Concrete Representational Abstract, or CRAI intervention, has been demonstrated to be an effective intervention for secondary level concepts, such as factoring linear equations and polynomials, as well as solving rate of change word problems. It's often implemented with a metacognitive component for problem solving that's like a heuristic or an acronym that students can use to go through a problem solving process. Stemming from my prior research, I looked at whether or not CRAI and PodCheck, which was my heuristic that I used, helped students improve their understanding and proficiency with solving rate of change word problems that involved both constant rates and variable rates. However, additional research is needed, in particular to investigate whether or not folks that are not just the principal investigators or researchers of a study can implement this. So in particular, this study will look at pre-service teachers, but we also need to know more about in-service teachers as well. Additionally, so we originally hadn't designed this as a virtual intervention, but we flipped it to Zoom at the last minute because of the COVID-19 pandemic. This presentation will go through two different studies actually, one that was implemented in spring 2020 and one that was done in fall of 2020. However, one thing that's interesting is that there is actually very little research that's been done on virtual mathematics interventions, meaning those that are done through like a telehealth or teleconferencing model. There's a lot that's done on mathematics interventions that incorporate technology, like video modeling, but hardly any on virtual interventions done in this manner. So this also adds to the research base in that way. There were two research questions for this study, but I'll only focus on the top one in blue here for today, which is there a functional relation between implementing an intervention incorporating CRAI and PodCheck and students' proficiency in solving slope word problems as measured by scores on researcher-created slope assessments? The second research question that we looked at was whether or not the intervention also led to an increase in student strategic thinking and motivation as measured by microanalysis. So I'm just putting that research question in there for context because it does come in, becomes relevant later on, but it's not going to be what we focus on. For study one, we had 4 participants. There were 3 white females and 1 white male. They were all in 7th through 9th grade. 2 were receiving services under a specific learning disability category, and 2 were actually going through the special education eligibility process. There were 3 interventionists, 2 were pre-service special education teachers, and 1 was a school psychology doctoral student. The intervention itself involved using CRAI and the PodCheck, a problem-solving heuristic. It was implemented one-on-one at least 3 days per week over Zoom, and the session length varied, but on average, it was about 77 minutes per session. So a little bit more about the intervention. CRAI, we involved for the concrete level, the interlocking centimeter cubes, which you can see in the picture right here with the blue cubes. For the representational level, it really was a pictorial demonstration or depiction of those cubes. And then the abstract level, students were largely writing out the equation in y equals mx plus b form. So as an example, here's just an example problem. There are actually 6 problem types that we included, but this is just one of those problem types. Ashley's making jewelry. She can make a half of a piece per hour. If she already has 4 pieces made, how many hours will it take her to make 11 pieces? So just to show you what this representation looks like, students build onto a set of white foundation cubes. On the first cube, this represents 0, so that's where they put their y-intercept. So there's 4 cubes here, which is how many pieces she started with. Then for that rate, you're adding 1 piece of jewelry every 2 hours. So that's why we're skipping the middle, just to that cube here. So 2 hours go by and we add 1, and then it follows that rate. In the diagram, students also wrote in and labeled numbers so that they could keep track of and look for any patterns that they could see as well. For the pod check, they went through the steps of propose, outline, defend, and check. For propose, they looked at what is the problem asking them to solve, and they identified key information given. For outline, they outlined how they would solve the problem. For defend, they described how they solved the problem after doing so, and also explained how they knew their answer made sense, also after solving the problem. And then last, we incorporated a check step because oftentimes students in mathematics struggle with actually checking their work. And for the check steps, we operationalized it a little bit for them. So they reread the problem, checked to make sure they set it up correctly, checked their calculations, and then checked for common mistakes, which could vary across participants. Here's an overview of the lesson sequence and content. Lessons 1 and 2 involved prerequisite skills. Lessons 3 through 5, we worked with problems that didn't have y-intercepts, so they were a little bit simpler of problem, but we went through how to solve for different missing variables. So missing y, missing x, or missing m in that equation, y equals mx plus b. Lesson 6 was mixed practice with the problems that have been introduced so far. Lessons 7 through 9, we expanded into working with problems with y-intercepts, following that same approach of missing y, missing x, missing m. Lesson 10 was a mixed practice for just the y-intercept problems. And then lessons 11 and 12 were mixed practice of all 6 problem types. For our dependent variables, we used students' percentage of points earned on a researcher-created assessment, which was developed specifically to measure students' ability to solve slope word problems. There were 6 word problems included on each assessment, each of a different problem type. And for each item, students wrote an equation, found the answer, filled in and created a table, and also sketched a graph. We also looked at student self-regulated learning, which once again, I'm not going to go into depth on that today, but it is important to note for context that we conducted brief microanalysis interviews where students were asked about what kind of strategies they might use to solve a problem, and then also rate whether or not they thought they got problems correct. In study 1, we used a multiple baseline across participants single case design to determine whether there was a functional relation between the intervention and dependent variables. We also used a randomized start points design in which we selected 2 potential intervention start dates for each participant and then used a random number generator to select the start point. This is a design that I learned about at the IES Single Case Design Institute, and I was curious to try it out. And additionally, it was helpful just when everything was unpredictable in the fall to have all of our participants be on a predictable schedule. We could tell the parents exactly when their students would be starting intervention, which I think was reassuring at that time. In terms of our procedures, we started with training. It was a little bit rushed just because of COVID-19 shutting things down right at that moment as well. But I met once individually with each interventionist to explain the key components of the intervention. I also met once with a full group of interventionists to go over study procedures and the lesson content. And one thing that's helpful to note is that the school psychology doctoral student had previously shadowed me during a pilot test to observe and assist with the same intervention. Next, we distributed hard copy materials to participants and interventionists. So everyone had centimeter interlocking cubes, a dry erase board, a ruler, and a calculator. And the students had just student versions of their lessons. The interventionists had scripted teacher versions as well as the student versions, and everyone had copies of the assessments. For baseline, interventionists met one-on-one with their participants over Zoom 1 to 3 days per week. They administered rate of change assessment. They also conducted 1 or 2 microanalysis interviews. It was 1 for participant 1 and then 2 for the other participants so that we could have 1 at the beginning and 1 at the end of baseline. Participants' parents sent me pictures of their completed assessments. During intervention, we also had interventionists meeting one-on-one with their participants over Zoom 3 days a week. They taught the lesson using scripted lessons and then followed the same procedures in terms of administering rate of change assessment or conducting a microanalysis interview. The microanalysis interviews were conducted after lessons 2, 5, 8, and 11, and assessments were conducted after all of the others. During maintenance, we returned to baseline conditions and also conducted 3 microanalysis interviews. So we alternated days with assessments at that stage. For assessment scoring, and one thing just to note is for this presentation, I'm just going to look at 2 components of the scores out of the assessments, equation and final answer. In study 1, we scored these on a scale of 0, 0.5, or 1, and you can look at some of the indicators that we used to score based on that. But we wanted to give students an opportunity to get some partial credit as a way to get a little bit more of a sensitive measure. Here are the results from study 1. I've also noted which interventionist was with which student. So we have interventionist A that was with P1 and P2, and then interventionist B with P3 and interventionist C with P4. Overall, our fidelity scores are all very high. You can see those in the center. And for our answer scores and then equation scores, the results also look very promising. So in terms of answer scores, all of the participants made good improvements, and we can see a demonstration of an effect across at least 3 points in time. Participant 2 is a little bit more challenging to tell for sure, since they did have 2 assessments where they got all 6 problems correct during baseline, but during intervention and then during maintenance, they got more consistent and decreased that variability. So there is still evidence of some effect occurring there. For equation, things are a little bit more mixed there as well. Participant 2, it's a little bit more challenging to tell whether or not there's a true effect there, but it does appear that there is, especially since there was a decreasing trend in baseline, increasing trend in intervention, and that was maintained during maintenance as well. For participants 1 and 4, very clear effects that occurred there. And participant 3 never wrote an accurate equation or even solved that with enough to get even a partial point. In terms of adjustments for study 2, we expanded the study to include 9 participants. We had 7 females and 2 males. We also had a slightly more diverse sample with 1 student who was Hispanic and white and 1 student who was African American and white. These were self-reported by their parents as well. And then for disability categories, we had several students that were receiving special ed services for math under the category of speech language impairment. We also had students receiving special ed services for math under specific learning disability, other health impairment, or autism spectrum disorder. Additionally, we had 1 student who received services for special education under SLI and was in the process of undergoing eligibility to add math services to those they already received. We had 6 interventionists for this round of the study. The school psychology doctoral student continued working on it. We also had 3 new and different ones than the last study: pre-service special education teachers, 1 pre-service elementary education teacher, and 1 pre-service music therapist. The music therapist did actually have some teaching background in more informal context. So there wasn't any in-school or certification. She wasn't a certified teacher, but had taught groups of students before. For the intervention, we shortened and clarified lessons. I added pictures of cubes and diagrams to the teacher versions to provide a little bit more instructional support for them. I also provided interventionists with PowerPoints to use during the lessons that included pictures of cubes and diagrams too, with the goal of aiding them in modeling the content. Implementation largely stayed the same, except school was back in session for everybody now, since it was the fall of 2020. So participants and interventionists still met 3 days per week, but we limited the lesson time per session to about 70 minutes because there was also assessments occurring in those sessions. So their overall session time was 90 minutes, and we didn't want to go beyond that since these students were meeting outside of school hours, largely after school. In terms of our measures, we also adjusted those. We created an electronic version of the assessment on Qualtrics so that we wouldn't have to manage quite as much data that was just in picture form. We incorporated some prerequisite and extension problems that were drawn from the AIMS progress monitoring measures as well. For an experimental design, we actually went back to using more of a traditional response guided format, just because we hadn't had reviewers yet look at our randomized start point design, and we got a little nervous about how reviewers might respond. We also started intervention, so that means that we started intervention for participant 1 after there was demonstration of a stable decreasing trend in baseline, and then we started the subsequent participants after a prior participant showed an increase of at least 10% in scores. For our procedures, we had interventionist training in which the interventionist completed a self-paced module to learn key components of the intervention and go over intervention procedures. They had to receive a score of at least 90% on a quiz to proceed. We also met once with a full group of interventionists to go over and model Zoom features and lesson content. Distributed hard copy materials to participants and interventionists again. It was the same materials that were distributed, except that this time we didn't give them paper copies of the assessments. During baseline, the procedure stayed the same as study 1, except we decided that we would administer a microanalysis interview every session as well. So they did a rate of change quiz first, and then they did a microanalysis interview after that. And the assessment, as I've noted already, was completed electronically over Qualtrics. We also made it timed for study 2 since we had incorporated some of the problems that were drawn from the Ames progress monitoring measures. For the intervention, we had interventionists meet one-on-one with their participants over Zoom 3 days per week. They taught the lesson using the scripted lessons and PowerPoints this time. We also implemented a motivational system in which students graphed their most recent scores. And they also either administered an assessment or conducted a microanalysis interview. The interviews were conducted after lessons 2, 5, 9, 11, and 12, and assessments were conducted after all of the other lessons. And we also doubled up on lessons 11 and 12 and did an assessment and a microanalysis interview. For maintenance, we returned to baseline conditions, but we actually only reached the maintenance phase for 2 participants. We decided we wanted to get a little bit more sensitivity in how we were scoring for equation and final answer as well. So you can see how we broke up our rubric a little bit more so that we could grade it into quarter points in addition. Okay, here are the results. So once again, I've shown you which interventionist was paired with which student, so you can go by those letters. It's also helpful to note that interventionist C worked on the study 1, that was the doctoral student. Also, Twyla had interventionist C as well as interventionist E because we started off with interventionist C, but because of the schedule of that interventionist, it didn't align well. Sessions were occurring right during Twyla's dinner time, so we made an adjustment and gave her a different interventionist. When we look at these results, they're a lot more mixed. And in particular, one thing that I think is notable is that there are several participants that have increasing trends during baseline. We think that this actually might be an effect of the microanalysis. Even though the microanalysis wasn't teaching students how to solve problems at all, it could be that, especially for students who are being exposed to some of this content in their typical instruction in school, it might be that having someone ask them questions just to prompt them to think about strategies to solve problems and reflect on whether or not they did solve them well could have been enough to actually see some change. We don't know, and this design didn't really control for that, so that's a question for future research. Other than that, we can see that there are several students across multiple points in time that did make improvements, especially when you look at the trend lines, which I've included during intervention for you. There are other participants where it's much more challenging to tell, in particular because we have some that have decreasing trends or flat trends during intervention. Also, when we look at comparing answer versus equation, students overall had greater improvements and also higher levels for answer. They struggled more for equation. Okay, additional adjustments that are good to note just in terms of study 2. I met with the interventionist 1 to 2 times during the study for additional support and just to talk how things were going. And then also due to time and schedule limitations, we ended up creating abbreviated versions of lessons 8, 9, and 11, and we actually cut out lessons 10 and 12. So Olivia and Sabrina completed lessons 1 through 12, and those were the only 2 that made it to the maintenance phase. And Twyla, Theo, Forrest, Fiona, and Alyssa made it through the full versions of lessons 1 through 7 and the abbreviated versions of 8, 9, and 11. Sierra completed lessons 1 through 8, and Elijah completed lessons 1 through 6. For both Sierra and Elijah, they had many canceled sessions, and also they tended to move through the lessons a little bit slower, so they spanned more days and just didn't make it quite as far. So just based on time limitations, I'm not going to talk in depth about limitations and future directions for these studies because, one, there are several limitations that I think are worthy of a much more involved discussion and lots of different directions I would like to take this. But for the purpose of the panel today, I really want us to think more about the fidelity component in particular. Overall, the fidelity scores across both of these studies were high. The lowest one was a 93%, and most of them were above 95%. However, I question whether or not this actually tells the full story. So in particular, I'm curious about additional things that interventionists might have done. One interventionist mentioned using a secret handshake with her participants over Zoom as a reinforcer and a way to keep them motivated and engaged. And we know that that matters a lot when it comes to mathematics. And I think especially when these students were doing Zoom sessions that were long, 3 days a week after school, after they had already done a full day of school, I think that engagement and motivation factor could really play a role. Additionally, we don't know about the degree of quality of implementation, and there are things that can matter in terms of the quality with which you do them. So I think modeling is a really good example of that. You can model a concept with a degree of different levels of quality there, and that's not something that our fidelity measure was able to capture since it was just a dichotomous measure. Additionally, we don't know about distractions in the students' environments interfering with learning. We do know that there were distractions, though, based on how our Zoom sessions went. Sometimes the students were in Zoom sessions while their family was preparing dinner. Sometimes they were in the kitchen even at that same time. And there was a variety of other distractions in the home environment as well. The other thing that the virtual intervention introduces is a technology fidelity question. So there were frequent, it depended on the interventionist and also the participant, but there were different Zoom glitches that occurred either on interventionist or participants' end in terms of audio cutting out or internet connection getting disrupted, having trouble just with actually sharing your screen or showing a picture. So all of that could have played a role in fidelity overall and wasn't incorporated in our checklists whatsoever. Additionally, we don't know if different training or background knowledge impacts whether or not interventionists fidelity for one or student outcomes. And then one of the big questions that I have too is since CRAI relies on concrete materials, I am not sure whether doing the virtual implementation significantly altered really the core of the intervention. The interventionists and participants each had their own sets of concrete materials, but they weren't able to really interact as fluently together with them. And we don't know if that's really a key part of CRA or CRAI. So this really leads us to the question that a lot of people are considering within implementation science, which is what line do or should we draw between making adaptations and maintaining absolute fidelity? These questions and even more align with calls in recent mathematics intervention studies to more fully investigate intervention fidelity. So I hope to do that in some of my future studies stemming from this. So just to conclude with some acknowledgements, first off to my USU collaborators, Doctors Mary Ellen McLean-Verdoes and Gregory Callan, as well as the graduate and undergraduate students in our labs, and also to the Office of Research at Utah State University, who provided funding for this study through a Research Catalyst C grant. I hope to see you all at our live session, and feel free to reach out if you've got questions.
Hi, my name is Amber Ray, and I'm from the University of Illinois at Urbana-Champaign. I'll be presenting on a year-long study of using an SRSD writing intervention. Self-regulated strategy development, or SRSD, includes explicit strategy instruction, genre instruction, and support for self-regulation. Strategy instruction was selected because it has a strong impact on writing, and SRSD is an evidence-based practice. Setting for this study was in a high-needs elementary school. The school did a school-wide initiative to help improve the writing scores of students within their school. There were 17 teachers in the school who participated, and they were all taught in inclusive classrooms where there were students who were general education, students receiving special ed services, and English language learners. Teachers taught 1st through 5th grade. All teachers received practice-based professional development to help them learn how to effectively teach strategies using SRSD. The PBPD included collaboration, a lot of modeling of the lessons, contextualizing the lessons within their school and with their students. The teachers had a lot of opportunities to practice the lessons and receive feedback. Each quarter of the school year included 1 full day of PBPD at the beginning. Partway through the quarter, there was a half day of PBPD and at least 1 individual classroom visit and coaching session for each teacher. So provided a lot of PBPD and was frequently in the school quarter 1, quarter 2, quarter 3, and quarter 4. The instruction the teachers implemented followed the SRSD model, where there is the 6 stages of SRSD instruction for developing background knowledge, discussing the strategy, modeling the strategy, memorizing the strategy, supporting in the gradual release of control, and then independent implementation of the strategy. Students also learned self-regulation and genre-specific strategies. For quarter 1, the instruction focused on informative writing using the TIDE strategy. Quarter 2 focused on opinion writing using TREE. Quarter 3 was narrative writing using the WWW strategy. And all of those lessons and units throughout the quarters were all aligned to the Common Core state standards. Quarter 4, students really learned to pull apart the prompt and be able to identify what genre were they being asked to write in, and then how do you, based on that genre, what strategy do you pick, and then practicing, making their notes, writing the essay, and revising. The SRSD instruction included the strategy POW, which taught students to pull apart that prompt. Then based on what the prompt said for what genre to write in, they organized their notes using one of the genre-specific strategies, and then wrote their essay. The results of the study were very promising. All essays were scored for planning, total words written, transition words, quality, and genre elements. For informative essays, here's an example of a 5th grader. The pre-test, they weren't quite sure of what to include. By post-test, they had 14 informative genre elements and really had a clear topic, important evidence and details, and were able to wrap up their essay. For the informative results, the students made gains in all of the areas that were assessed. The gains were statistically significant in essay planning, total words written, and the informative essay genre elements. Big takeaways were that students learned to use the TIDE strategy. They wrote longer essays that included the key informative genre elements. Students needed more support for the quality of their essays and needed explicit instruction and practice on how to use transition words. For opinion essays, here's an example of a 2nd grader who pre-test did not know how to plan. By post-test, was able to use a clear strategy, make a plan ahead of time. And then pre-test, they included 1 sentence with an opinion. By post-test, the student wrote a clear paragraph with an opinion and reasons to support their opinion along with transition phrases. For the opinion writing, all of the gains were statistically significant for planning, total words written, transition words, essay quality, and essay elements. Key takeaways: students were using TREE to plan. They wrote longer essays and included transition words. They still needed more support, particularly on grammar and mechanics. Some students needed some support on how to choose a side and express a clear opinion. And some students needed instruction on how to further continue and increase the number of genre elements in their essays. Narrative essays, the students, many of them at the beginning weren't sure how to write a story. And then by post-test, students were including many of the narrative genre elements, and we're starting to really grasp how do you craft a narrative. The narrative results, there were statistically significant gains for essay planning, essay quality, total words written, and number of narrative genre elements. Takeaways where students are using the WWW strategy to plan. They're writing essays that included key narrative genre elements, but they continue to need more support for the overall quality, particularly looking at that grammar and mechanics. So the results overall, students made a lot of really great gains, and we're really excited to see that. Then we started to look at the implementation fidelity. And so all teachers were observed for implementation fidelity and implementation quality. But on a more day-to-day basis, the teachers completed an instructional fidelity checklist looking at the % of steps they completed from the fidelity checklist for each individual lesson. Across each genre, there were 8 lessons that teachers were to implement. So teacher self-report, there was a lower than anticipated percent of steps that teachers completed for the instructional fidelity, with informative being 67%, opinion 63% of the steps on the fidelity checklist was averaged to complete, and narrative 60%. And so really looking at this and contextualizing this piece of that the teachers were not volunteers, it was the whole school was asked to participate, or the whole school was doing a school-wide initiative to implement this focus on writing and doing a writing intervention. So teachers were really, there was a wide variety of teacher buy-in, which I think is part of the reason why I had such a large variation in the range of the percent of steps that teachers chose to implement. And so doing some preliminary analysis really looked at, did a deeper dive of looking at each lesson that teachers were asked to implement. So lesson 1 is where teachers introduce the strategy. They look at the genre specifically, identify the different genre parts within an example essay. Here, teachers started out strong. 100% of the teachers taught this lesson. However, then looked at the percent of teachers who implemented all the steps of this lesson. And for an informative and narrative, majority of teachers implemented all the steps. For opinion, many of them only was 46% of the teachers who actually implemented all of the steps for lesson 1. In lesson 1, the important part is it's introducing the strategy for the first time. Talking about what is this new genre, in this case, informative. What does it look like to write in that genre? Analyzing an example essay, making notes, and then talking about the note writing process. And notes are short and quick. Lesson 2 goes through and identifies the genre elements in another example essay. And this one has some focus on pulling apart the prompt, teaching students how to analyze a written prompt. Again, most of the teachers taught this lesson, but 75% or less of the teachers implemented all of the steps for this lesson. This lesson is important in teaching students how do you actually pull apart that prompt, and what is the prompt asking me to write about? What genre am I being asked to write in? And then looking at a sample essay that was written in response to that prompt. Lesson 3, again, more discussion about the genre, what's included in that genre, and then identifying and analyzing a poorly written essay. So it was a high percentage of teachers who taught this lesson. And then the percent of teachers who implemented all the steps for this lesson varied. From informative, only 46% of the teachers actually implemented all of the steps. This lesson is important to really help students begin seeing how they can analyze writing, beginning that understanding of the revision process. How might you see where you can improve essays? Modeling, making notes, adding missing parts, adding transitions, and revising an essay. Some examples of the graphic organizers we used. Lesson 4 is modeling the whole writing process, from pulling apart the prompt, making notes, writing the essay, and revising. Majority of teachers taught this lesson. However, only about 50% of the teachers actually implemented all the steps of this lesson. And modeling is a really crucial lesson where it's the teacher think aloud. Many teachers in this case, when looking at it more deeply, many of them modeled the pulling apart the prompt and the planning, but skipped modeling how to write the essay. This lesson also includes modeling and how to develop those self-instructions and self-evaluation. And some teachers really did a nice job implementing it, and many of them skipped this part, likely due to not understanding the strong benefits of teaching students self-regulation strategies. The ones who did teach it, here are some examples of some bulletin boards and ways they really tried to engage students with self-instructions. Lesson 5 is group collaborative writing, and this begins that gradual release of control, where students take on more of the responsibility of writing, planning and writing an essay, with the teacher there to provide that support and a lot of guidance. Here, 75% or more, and from 75 to 85% of the teachers taught this lesson. But again, it was 50% or less of the teachers implemented actually all of the steps. So really lesson 5 is where we start to see a big drop off of what is being taught. Lesson 6 is where teachers have students review their prior performance and compare students to where they were at pre-test to what they can do now, showing students and trying to really get student buy-in to using these strategies and establishing goals to write better essays. Here, again, only about 50% of the teachers taught this lesson, and most of them, there's very few teachers who implemented all of the steps of this lesson. Those who did, here's an example of the graphing progress, having class goals and individualized writing goals. Lesson 7 is more collaborative writing, but now students are working in small groups or partners to really help these students wean off the graphic organizer, begin to work more independently, but having a partner and being able to ask and get support from the teacher. Anywhere from 46 to 67% of the teachers taught this lesson, but the percent of teachers who implemented all the steps was very low. And it decreases further from there in lesson 8. This is where teachers give students the opportunity to practice independent writing, trying and using those strategies independently. This lesson is really important as it allows teachers to see what can students do on their own. If they're stuck, the teacher can still provide help. It helps teachers see, wait, maybe I need to go back and do this lesson or do a little mini lesson here to give some students some support or see who maybe is still struggling. Many of the teachers did not teach this lesson in quarter 2. For opinion, only one teacher taught lesson 8. And the percent of teachers who implemented all the steps for this lesson, it was only one teacher for informative and narrative, and no teachers completed all the steps for this lesson for opinion. So looking at what are some of the key takeaways, the big kind of piece with this is that this study was done as part of a school-wide initiative, right? So, and teachers implementing the intervention. So did some really kind of thinking about how can we improve some of that implementation fidelity. First thing is having some administrative support and leadership within the school to really support teachers in their implementation. Working more on teacher buy-in and really helping teachers see how this will help their students and improve the writing of all of their students. In post-study interviews, teachers often cited instructional time as the reason for skipping steps or for just skipping lessons altogether, that they frequently said they focused and had more time dedicated to reading or math, and that writing often went by the wayside. Also helping teachers develop an understanding of the importance of instructional fidelity and why it's important to include all of those steps on that fidelity checklist. All of those steps have a clear purpose and reason and way to help support their students. Providing additional practice-based professional development for more practice, more modeling, to help students help teachers increase their confidence in teaching using that intervention. And also providing opportunities for teacher collaboration and support, whether it's in professional learning communities or grade level teams, to help teachers increase their confidence, but also have others they can go to on a more day-to-day or weekly basis for more support when implementing the intervention. Thank you all so much for your time.
Hi, I'm John Romig from the University of Texas at Arlington, and I'm going to be talking about a study I conducted in the spring of 2020 called Effects of a Repeated Reading Intervention Delivered Online to Elementary Students. So a little bit of background. First of all, COVID-19 school closures disrupted many aspects of K-12 education. And if there is an award for the biggest understatement of the conference, that has to be it. But teacher preparation, as a teacher educator, our life was also negatively impacted. So students in our courses lost their opportunities to participate in field experiences. They also lost opportunities to practice teaching reading to fellow classmates, to see me practice in front of them in the classroom, and to get feedback on their teaching in person. And so anyway, these things negatively impacted pre-service teachers' education. It also provided some opportunities for innovation. And the innovation that we'll be discussing today is virtual delivery of reading interventions. A PCRC audience is no doubt familiar with the concept of reading fluency. It's very important. This is one thing that I will say is that for pre-service teachers, our undergraduates, we want them to be familiar with reading fluency. We want them to be familiar with how to intervene on students' reading fluency and the importance that reading fluency has in overall reading, reading comprehension. So when it comes to reading fluency interventions that students graduating from a special education program need to have mastered, it's hard to argue with repeated reading, and it's hard to identify a better intervention that we would rather have them be familiar with. So repeated readings is an intervention with a long history of success in improving students' reading fluency. It's probably the most commonly used procedure or intervention for improving reading fluency in schools. This is recommended by the What Works Clearinghouse. It's widely regarded as sort of the go-to intervention for improving reading fluency in students. Specifically today in this presentation, I'll be talking about an intervention called Reread, Adapt, and Answer Comprehend, RAAC. This is a specific repeated reading intervention that incorporates modeling of fluent reading, error correction, feedback from an adult tutor, students repeatedly reading a passage until a criterion is met. There's a typo on that slide. It's not until an error is met, it's until a criterion is met. And then prompting students for both fluency and comprehension, and then a question generation component that is designed to improve students' reading comprehension. So the last two aspects here, the prompting for fluency and comprehension and the question generation component, are really what distinguish this RAAC from other repeated reading interventions. So the goal of RAAC is to improve both students' reading fluency and directly their reading comprehension. Other repeated reading interventions get at reading fluency or get at reading comprehension indirectly by improving students' reading fluency. But this intervention is really designed to do both at the same time. So this intervention has improved outcomes for post-secondary students with autism, upper elementary students with learning disabilities, and elementary students both with and without disabilities. So again, when we think about interventions that we would like our pre-service teachers to be able to have mastered and to have exposure with and practice with, this is a great option for them. So there were two research questions guiding this study. The first is, when delivered online, does repeated reading practice with error correction and feedback improve correct reading fluency relative to a modeling only condition where students were, tutors modeled the passage, but students had not repeatedly read it. So they heard a model and then practice reading after hearing the model. 4 students in the first through 6th grade participating in a virtual reading program. The second research question is identical, except the dependent measure is changed, Instead of correct word reading fluency, it is word reading errors. So in the first question, we're trying to increase word reading fluency. And the second research question, we're trying to decrease word reading errors. So methods, this study was recruited via social media, actually thanks to a lot of PCRC attendees sharing tweets, retweeting tweets, sharing Facebook posts. The posts had a very broad reach, very wide reach. When parents expressed interest, they were sent more information in a survey link. If they were interested in participating, they completed the survey. 21 total students completed the recruitment process. Of those 21 students, only 10 are presented in today's analysis. So the ones that are presented in today's analysis were students in 1st through 6th grade who completed at least 5 online tutoring sessions. It's important to note that this study began at the very beginning of the COVID-19 school closures. So within the first week of schools being closed, the social media post went out and I started recruiting participants for this study. At that time, I think home lives were quite chaotic, and you might be thinking, aren't they still quite chaotic? But I think especially so then, parents were still trying to figure out, what are we going to be doing? How are we going to manage working from home and teaching from home their children? A lot of schools had not announced what they would be doing for school offerings. And so parents really didn't know what their school schedule from day to day would look like. As a result, some parents who initially joined the virtual reading program found out a week or so, 2 weeks into their program, into the virtual reading program, that it interfered and they had now too many things going on between juggling working from home, students' home virtual learning schedule, and then the virtual reading program turned out to be too much. So some dropped out altogether and some participated sort of sporadically throughout the semester. So to participate or to be included in the data analysis, the minimum threshold for tutoring sessions was 5 tutoring sessions to have participated in. And then obviously consent and assent to being included in the study. So the tutors were junior, undergraduate, special education majors. So these are students taking a literacy methods course. This is their first methods course in the special education program. And in the spring semester, they had been scheduled to participate in their first field experience. So these students really had no field exposure to students with disabilities, to instruction. They had no practice. They were very much beginning teachers. There were 5 tutors that participated in the program. 4 are presented here. One of them was removed from the analysis because her students in the program did not meet the inclusion criteria. So the setting was over Zoom, but one-on-ones, one tutor, one student, done on laptops and tablets. The dependent measures will again be familiar to PCRC attendees, correct words per minute. So students in the intervention read for 1 minute. The tutors counted the number of words that they read correctly. And then they also counted the number of word reading errors in that 1 minute of reading time and recorded both of these pieces of data. So there were 2 independent variables. The first was a model of fluent reading. The tutor modeled fluent reading. And then the second was the full intervention, again, with tutor modeling. So it was RAAC, the tutor modeled, the students repeatedly read passages, and then the tutor gave feedback on each reading, including error correction. So again, the materials, Zoom, laptops, and the reading passages were the same reading passages used in previous RAAC studies. And so special thanks to Bill Therian for sharing those with me. So these are 1st through 6th grade grade level passages based on the Flesch-Kincaid reading scale. There were 50 passages in each grade level. They're narrative passages, and they include a variety of topics that would be typical of children's literature. So the tutors training, some of the training was just standard curriculum for the course. They learned how to model, provide feedback, collect data through the course as just sort of standard protocol for what is expected in a methods course in special education. Specific to the intervention, I dedicated one 90-minute class period to going over the intervention procedures, data collection procedures. They practiced the intervention with one another, and then I gave feedback to them on their intervention delivery. Here are the procedures. First, the tutors modeled. Then students read each passage a minimum of 2 times, but no more than 4 times. There was a fluency criterion at each grade level that students were trying to meet. If they met that fluency criterion, they moved on to the next reading passage. If students met the fluency criterion on 3 consecutive passages, they increased to the next grade level. If they failed to meet the fluency goal on 3 consecutive passages, the grade level was decreased. So here are the implementation fidelity steps. I'm not going to read these for you. If you want to read over them, you can pause the video here and look at them more carefully. All tutoring sessions were recorded on Zoom. These recordings were used to check for adherence to the intervention steps and also used to calculate inter-observer agreement on the 2 dependent variables. I also collected students' data sheets to check for adherence to the decision-making rules on advancing or moving forward or backwards on the grade levels based on students meeting or not meeting the reading fluency goals. So this is an alternating treatment design using traditional visual analysis of single case designs. So a focus of this session, of this panel, is on implementation fidelity. And so the idea originally for this session was to look at implementation fidelity in terms of whether there were any associations with student outcomes. However, the tutors in this program completed, on average, 8 out of 9 intervention steps. There was a very small range, anywhere between 7 and 9 intervention steps were completed by all tutors in the program on each session. So not a lot of variability in terms of the number of intervention steps that participants completed. The most common step that students missed was they did not record answers to the comprehension questions. And so again, this is, for data collection purposes, not ideal. But I don't think it's something that really negatively affected their, it is not something that would be associated with students' outcomes. And so, again, for the purposes of this panel, implementation fidelity became a difficult variable to examine. So I'll show you here some of the results. And I won't spend a lot of time on these graphs. Again, there were 10 students, so we have 10 graphs. But I'll just sum it up by saying some of the students presented a very clear effect for the functional relationship between the intervention and correct words per minute. Others, not so much of a clear effect. On word reading errors, I think the effect was much less clear than it was for correct words per minute. And again, you can pause the video if you would like to look closer at any of these. Okay, so discussion. So implementation fidelity was similar across all tutors. That limited my ability to examine the relationship between implementation fidelity and student outcomes. However, as I said, the videos were recorded, there were qualitative differences in the teaching quality that the tutors had. They were not all equal in terms of their teaching ability. Some were more skillful teachers, some were less skillful teachers. But that level of nuance is not something that was detected in the implementation fidelity checklist. The implementation fidelity checklist also did not capture environmental aspects of the intervention. And that's sort of a fancy way of saying it did not capture chaotic home life that was going on at the beginning of the school closures and the pandemic. And so sometimes the intervention sessions might be interrupted by, another sibling in the room, one of the children, in the intervention, and having other distractions, people coming in and out of the room, or just, sort of general not being in a conducive intervention environment. And so these are all things that I think as we discuss implementation fidelity and consider what about an intervention needs to be held constant to be effective. I think that these are all sort of things that we need to think about. Often we think about implementation fidelity as a checklist or as very sort of rigid adherence to the items that we can clearly sort of identify and see and define. But I think that it's important for us to think about what are the more qualitative, and not necessarily qualitative in a research sense, but just what are the quality differences between implementation of an intervention that might not be picked up by a checklist. And so obviously there are other implications of this study and other discussion points that we can discuss further in our discussion time if you would like, but for the sake of this panel that was focused on implementation fidelity, those are some points that I wanted to bring up, and I look forward to discussing with you all shortly.